Kippy,
Yeah.
have you thought of hosting a worst haircut contest?
What?
He wants to know if you.
I'm just
hosting a
looking
first
around
haircut
and I look at myself every day. I'm wondering if we
Oh,
have
you
a
mean
worst
the-
haircut contest.
It's bad, I know.
That's how everybody's doing. Mr. Drill there, you're looking good. You're
Oh
looking,
yeah, take a look at this. I
Yeah,
can't
you
do
look
anything
at
about the
this.
gray, but I could do
Yeah,
something
look
about
at
the
that.
length.
like that.
Someone's
Hey, everybody, we're live on YouTube. I'm going to pass it over to Kippy in 1 second.
Andrew's on and Mrs. Moyer is on.
Hello.
Hello, Andrew. Let me know when you're going to give me the host, Chris.
Okay, so the only one is Mr. Hurley
You are the
and
host, Kippy.
Pardon?
You are the host.
Thank you. The only ones, Mr. Hurley and Miss AC.
Correct.
Mr. Hurley's there, isn't he? No, I guess not. That's
No.
McNally, sorry.
Kippy, there's a waiting room. So if you're the host, if you see someone go in the waiting room, you're going to have to let them in, okay?
Where do I find the waiting room?
If you click on participants, you'll have a right-hand side screen on your display.
Okay. The waiting room, is it down at the bottom?
No, it'll be on top. Right now it's empty. Everybody's in the meeting.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Okay, 7. I think we're going to start.
Hey, quick, are we being recorded?
Yes, you're being recorded and you're live on YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
I have an audio recording going.
Okay,
Someone is in the waiting room on an unknown number.
hey, Chris,
You can admit them, Kippy, since you're the host. I can't do anything right now.
you could co-host with her if you wanted to. You could be, you could look at the waiting room and let her take care of the meeting.
I cannot.
All right, Kip, you want to give it back to him to let the person in from the waiting room, then have him give it back to
Yeah,
you?
why don't you take it over, Chris, and ask who is in the waiting room, and then you can give it back
You
to
have
me.
to click on my name, right click on it and make me host.
Okay, hold on. Okay, it's coming back to you right now.
Okay, who is 908-268-8721? You're unmuted.
Denise.
Okay, go ahead, Chris. And then you can give it back to me.
Okay, Kippy, your host.
Okay, it says record paused. Is that correct? Greg Hurley's entered. I will admit him.
Okay, and you can click on the arrow to report to cloud, but it is broadcasting and recording on YouTube as well.
Okay. All right. So I think we have everybody, Greg. And let me see. And Jen is on just phone. All right, we're going to start. I'll bang the gavel. I'd like to call the June 2nd, 2020 regular meeting of the Bernards Township Planning Board to order. Everybody say the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty
Liberty
and
and justice for all.
in accordance with the requirements of the Open Public Meetings Law of 1975. Notice of the meeting of the Planning Board of the Township of Bernards was posted on the doors of the Municipal Building, Collier Lane, Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Was sent to the Bernardsville News, Whippany, New Jersey, to the Courier News, Bridgewater, New Jersey, and was electronically mailed to all those people who have requested individual notice. The following procedure has been adopted by the Bernards Township Planning Board. There will be no new cases heard after 10 p.m. and no new witnesses or testimony will be heard after 10:30 p.m. Since the municipal building is not open, this meeting is being conducted over Zoom video conferencing. The public will be able to view this meeting live on their computers via YouTube by clicking on the Watch the Meeting Live icon on the Bernards Township homepage. Public questions and comments from Bernards Township residents will be accepted only during the public questions, comments periods of the meeting. Please include your name and address and email and send it to ckiefer@bernards.org or call 908-204-3026, and I will repeat these instructions when we get to those portions of the meeting. Roll call, Ms. Kiefer, please.
Chairwoman Padici,
Here.
Ms. Acey,
Here.
Mr. Crane,
Here.
Committeeman Esposito,
Here.
Committeewoman Harris,
Here.
Mr. Hurley,
Mr. Hurley, you got to unmute yourself.
well, I see him.
He's got to figure out how to unmute himself anyway.
Yeah, he just to unmute yourself.
He's trying.
Brian.
Okay, I'll move on and come back.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ms. Manduke.
Here.
Mr. McNally,
Here.
Mr. Zidell,
Here.
Mr. Mergian,
Here.
Ms. Mastrangelo,
Here.
Mr. Banish,
Here.
Drill,
Here.
Mr. Schley,
Here.
and for the record, Ms. Kiefer is present. Back to Mr. Hurley.
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum. You may proceed.
Thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the approval of a resolution, Fairmount Cemetery Association of Newark and Somerset Hills, Block 2301, lots 12 and 18, 95 Mount Airy Road, preliminary and final site plan number PB19-007 approved. Those eligible to vote are Ms. Acey, Mr. Hurley, Mr. McNally, Mr. Zidell, Ms. Mastrangelo, and myself. So I'd like to have a motion to approve the resolution as drafted.
Kippy, this is draft.
Doing it now.
Okay.
2020-05-14-V5 as in version 5. So may I have a motion from any of those people to approve that resolution with that date as drafted, please?
So moved, Andrew McNally.
Thank you. A second?
Second.
Fred Hurley.
Second by Mr. Hurley. Roll call, please.
Ms. Acey,
Abstain.
Mr. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mr. Zidell,
Yes.
Ms. Mastrangelo,
Yes.
Chairwoman Padici.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, who made the initial motion?
Mr.
Mr. McNally.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item is a completeness hearing on Emerald Valley Homeowners Association, Inc., Block 11401, lots 37.01 and 42, 16 Harvest Way, and 181 Mountain Road, amended preliminary and final major subdivision, elimination of condition number PB 20-001. Mr. Schley, will you review your memo on May 28th?
Yes, I issued a completeness review memo dated May 28, 2020, simply stating that all of the items that were not previously waived, and the board waived, at the last meeting, the board waived the environmental impact report. All other items have been submitted.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Zelli, are you here for Emerald Valley?
I am present on behalf of the applicant.
Okay. May I have a motion to deem the application complete with the waivers that were approved at the prior meeting, please?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Greg Hurley?
Yes.
Okay, second.
I will second that, Joan Harris.
Okay, Committeewoman Harris will second it. Roll call, please, Ms. Kiefer.
Ms. Vacy,
Yes.
Mr. Crane,
Yes.
Committeeman Esposito,
Yes.
Committeewoman Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Hurley,
Yes.
McNally,
Yes.
Ms. Nanduk,
Yes.
Mr. Zidell,
Yes.
Chairwoman Padici.
Yes.
Thank you.
The next item on the
Miss me.
agenda is William J. Kearns and Virginia L. Kearns, Block 1602, Lot 201, 174 South Finley Avenue, preliminary and final major subdivision bulk variances, number PB 20-002. Mr. Schley, can you please review your memo of May 28, 2020?
Madam Chair. John
Yes.
Crane. I'm
Yeah.
going to recuse myself. I'm going to recuse myself.
Okay, okay.
So the best way to recuse
I-
yourself, that's it. He did it the right way. Go ahead.
Go ahead,
Okay,
Mr.
if the-
Schley.
My May 28th, 2020 review memo indicates that there are 7 outstanding items. The applicant's requesting waivers for at least 3 of them. And I'm assuming Mr. Zelli is here to speak to that.
Are you Mr. Zelli?
I am present on behalf of the applicants, and yes, I can speak to each of those items.
Okay, what about the other items, Mr. Schley?
Well, I know in the application, it indicated that 3 of the items were waivers being requested.
Correct.
And that would be items number 1, 6, and 7. And the other items are just.
So let's just have a clarification. Mr. Zelli, you're going to submit the other 4 items? You're just seeking the waiver on
Yes,
the
we
3?
will. I've reviewed the memo. We will submit items 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Okay, so it's just, the only thing in front of the board is your request for the waivers on the 3 items, correct?
That is correct. And just while we're mentioning 2, 3, 4, and 5, if possible, assuming that the other issues are dealt with, I would request that Mr. Schley be designated to deem 2, 3, 4, and 5 complete when they've been received. Hopefully to expedite things. They're fairly straightforward items.
That's up to the board.
Of course.
In other words,
Okay.
he's asking that the board delegate the completeness determinant, assuming that the board grants the 3 waivers. Mr. Zelli is asking that the board then delegate the job of deeming the application complete upon the submission of the 4 other items. Mr. Zelli, that's what you're asking them, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Do we need a vote on that, Mr. Drill, or can I
Yeah,
just? do a-
I suggest you address the waivers first and then
Okay.
address the other thing, but that would absolutely need a vote to delegate the completeness determination.
All right, so I guess we need a waiver on the LOI issued by the NJDEP verifying the absence of wetlands and wetlands transition on the property. Mr. Zelli, do you want to comment on that?
I would just comment briefly, as Mr. Schley's indicated, there was one issued at one time back in 2004. It's since expired. I know the board's familiar with this property, the topography, it's obviously high. I don't think it'd be possible to have wetlands on it, just given the topography. And given the relatively minor nature of this application, it's only a major subdivision on a technicality as it is. I would ask that that waiver be granted.
Okay, what about number 6, general soil information, including soil logs?
My understanding is the reason for that is that we don't need too much in the way of stormwater management, if any, such that would require such logs. Obviously, we don't need septic on this property. It's a sewer property. It would just be an unnecessary expense for the applicant, and that's the basis for that request.
And number 7?
Number 7, again, this would normally just be a minor subdivision. It's because of the fact that we had a lot line adjustment in history on this lot brings this into your major subdivision category. But otherwise, it's just not the type of application that would warrant doing an environmental impact statement. This is an established section of town in the middle of a residential neighborhood, as you're aware.
Okay, any board members want to comment on Mr. Zelli's request for the 3 waivers? Mr. Sly, would you like to comment at all?
Well, I think number 7, the environmental impact assessment project report, is an easier one because, as Mr. Zelli was saying, this project is really a technical major subdivision. The reason for that is that this application in itself is a minor subdivision. There's an existing house and they're proposing to split the lot in 2 and build 1 new house. But because there was a prior minor subdivision application, our ordinance says that any subsequent subdivision application must be deemed a major subdivision application. And this application did have the prior subdivision application on this property was only a lot line adjustment. Some board members probably recall that. And the proposal that's before the board now basically takes care of the balance of the property. So there's not going to be another request for a further subdivision. So the ordinance concern about doing 1 minor subdivision after another and after another without having to do an environmental report doesn't really apply here. This is really a minor subdivision application, only classified as a major, and because of that classification, the environmental impact report is required. So I really don't see the point in requiring the applicant to prepare that report for what is, from all intents and purposes, a minor subdivision to build 1 new home.
Okay, and what about the other 2 items?
Well, the item number 1, the letter of interpretation, the LOI is also a requirement for a major subdivision. If this was technically a minor subdivision, the applicant would be required to provide a letter from a consultant confirming that there's no wetlands on the property. So if you look at it in that regard, the applicant's really even requesting a waiver for what would be required if we truly looked at this as a minor subdivision. And the information we have is 16 years old. I know Mr. Zelli pointed to the topography, the upper portion of the property, which is the part of the property that we're dealing with. It's significantly higher in elevation than nearby wetlands. So I certainly wouldn't suspect there'd be any wetlands there, but that's, I don't know that I, could say that for sure.
And what about the soil logs and the soil information?
The soil information is really for the board engineer to consider when reviewing the stormwater management design. If it includes dry wells, the soil logs would tell whether or not the ground has enough percolation to accept the stormwater. That's I don't know to what degree how important that is in this particular application, but I believe the applicant is proposing an infiltration system for the stormwater. And at some point, if the board were to approve the application, they're going to have to do soil logs anyway for the engineering department. I really don't see why we wouldn't want those up front.
It might just be a point if we could establish as part of the hearing process exactly to what extent that would be necessary, and to be somewhat speculative now. I think that'd be the only reason we'd want to delay it. Obviously, this is just completeness for purposes of completeness, not deeming it way to complete.
Mr. Zelli, it's completeness for purposes of starting the clock on how much time they have to decide the application. So when you say it's not just for purposes of completeness has a purpose. If the soil logs are needed to help the engineer determine what type of stormwater drainage system, it seems to me that's something you'd want the professional to have before the board starts hearing the application, and not after it starts and the time clock is running, and then they ask for the information, and then they have to deal with granting extensions and all that.
Thank you, Mr. Zelli. Any comments from board members about the three applications for waivers? Yes, no, any discussion about them? Mr. Zidell, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd be inclined not to grant the waiver on the soil logs.
But that means you would be inclined to grant it for the environmental statement and the, what's the other one?
The LOI.
The LOI, correct?
Yes.
I'd like to make a
Anybody else?
comment. I'd like to make a comment on the request for the environmental impact report. This part of Basking Ridge, this particular stretch of South Finley Avenue has stone walls on each side of the road, and there are some mature trees that also line the streets. I would say that it is an important element of community character in the neighborhood. And I think we may want to see, or the board may wish to see, some comments about those features, how they intend to be treated, and why they intend to treat them the way they do. So it may be an environmental impact assessment of a somewhat limited variety, but I do think there are some important cultural and man-made features in the area that are important to give some consideration and evaluation to.
Thank you, Mr. Banish. I'm sorry for not calling on you before the board.
Yeah, just to address that briefly. Those features we are maintaining. So there wouldn't be any impact in terms of taking down walls or preserving the trees, as far as I know.
But that's what your environmental impact statement will say. It will, what Mr. Banish is looking for is to recognize what's there and then to say if it's going to have an impact or not. Then if the statement says we're not going to touch that, then let's say the application comes before the board, that's going to end up being a condition of the approval rather than waiting again till in the hearing to discuss it. You're basically taking that issue out of contention by submitting the environmental impact statement and saying it right there.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
think that's what Mr.
Drill.
Banish is looking for.
Any other comments?
So what about?
Since I had a comment before, it's ideal. I would say that I would reconsider what I said before. Well, it's not entirely clear to me how broad the environmental impact statement has to be. It doesn't seem prudent to waive it, the requirement right now for the reasons Mr. Banish said. So I would change my view on that one as well.
So what you're saying is you would move to grant one waiver from not from the LOI, but not from the environmental impact statement and not from the soil
Logs.
Yes, sir,
what you're
that's
saying,
correct.
Mr. Zidell?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, anybody else have any comments on Mr. Zidell's proposal?
I'm inclined,
Or yeah, a
Greg-
different?
Greg Hurley, Kippy. I'm inclined to go along with what Mr. Zidell has said and backed by our two board professionals. It seems reasonable that the applicant should provide those general soil information and the environmental impact. I know it's, easy to say, let's just skip these because we don't want to spend the money. But ultimately, we have to make the decision, and without the information, I think it would be foolhardy for us to make that decision.
May I be heard again on the environmental impact statement? As Mr. Schley indicated and I indicated, it's only because of a happenstance that this is a major. If this didn't happen to have a lot line adjustment years ago, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. I really don't think it's appropriate, and I don't think the board needs it. From what I'm understanding from Mr. Drill, the point is to recognize whether the stone wall will be preserved, whether the mature trees will be preserved. It's already shown on the plans. If an environmental impact statement is going to be required, I would at least request some guidance as to the limitation as to what it needs to include. Because to do a full-blown environmental impact statement, what is in fact a minor subdivision, really doesn't make sense.
I think Mr. Banish said it would be limited to the stone wall and the trees. That's what I heard him say. Is that correct, Mr. Banish?
Generally, yes. When this application came in the last time for development, the board focused, I would say, intensely on the potential impact of the modified dwelling. I think it was a substantial modification of the existing dwelling at the time, basically with the view that this was essentially sacred ground because it was so close to the center of town in Basking Ridge, and it so effectively actually embodied the character of the community. So yes, I would say focus on the man-made features and the historic features in the area so that the board can give due weight and consideration to those same features that the board gave consideration to the last time development was approved for the tract. I have not seen the LOI. I do not know the limits of the wetlands or any buffers, or whether they're proposing any development within proximity to areas previously identified as wetlands for the property or transition areas. To the extent that that may be the case, there should be some narrative description of potential impacts to those features as well.
Can I make a suggestion? They have, I understand that there was an LOI, but it's expired. Is that correct, Mr. Zelli?
Yes.
So maybe the environmental impact assessment can just reference the old LOI, attach a copy to it. It's expired. So the board's going to grant a waiver from having to do a new one, but that's how they'll address that in the environmental impact assessment. How's that sound, Mr. Banish?
It sounds agreeable.
Mr. Zelli, how's that? Is that the way to deal with that?
If that's what the board would like to see, that's what we can do.
Yeah, I just would caution the applicant that if there are potential impacts to these features, they should address them.
Understood.
Thank you, Mr. Banish. Any other comments on what we will waive and what we will not waive? So at this point, what's on the table is that we will grant only one waiver, the LOI issued by the DEP, and all the other items will have to be, we will be declining potentially to waive the general soil information as well as the project report environmental impact assessment.
Right, but with the understanding that Mr. Banish has stated on the record, it's a limited environmental impact assessment. And he stated it's basically stone wall, trees, and the impact on any wetlands that were reflected on the previously issued LOI, which has now expired.
Right,
Mr.
along
Banish?
with, yes, along with potential impact on potentially historic features in the vicinity.
Mr. Zelli, did you write all that down?
Yes.
Okay, any other comments from the professionals or the board?
No, Madam Chair.
Yeah, did we discuss number 5?
They're submitting number
five.
2, 3, 4, and 5. He started out in the front saying they're going to submit them.
We're going to submit them. So, Mr. Drill, then the last item is, are we going to delegate numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 to
Yeah, but
Mr. Sly
it no longer applies, in my opinion. If the board had granted all the waivers, then it's easy. If he submits 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'd have no problem with you delegating that. But now there's a judgment call because he's going to be submitting an environmental impact assessment and the soil logs. Now, who would you, unless you're willing to delegate that to Dave Banish instead of Dave Schley, since Dave Banish is the one who specified what he wants in the environmental impact assessment. Normally that would get, if you're going to delegate it, you would delegate it to Schley. In this case, if you're looking to delegate, I would delegate it to Banish because he's the one that has the particulars for that particular item.
Okay, so I guess the question is, what is the feeling of the board about delegating those items? Do you wish to delegate them to Mr. Banish? Or do you wish that basically the applicant would come back, right, Mr. Drill?
That's correct. Like any
with
other
those
applicant.
items completed.
Well, he could come back after those items are submitted to the board, Dave Schley, and me, and he can notice for a hearing the same night that he anticipates that completeness determination, and there doesn't have to be any delegation of authority on this.
Okay, that doesn't, with all due respect, that doesn't make sense to me.
Okay?
What he wants to do is he wants someone to look at it, so he doesn't have to come back to the board. I know what you're setting up is he could start the hearing that night. But what we heard from Mr. Schley, and I thought what we heard from you is, those items need to be submitted so you can do your reports. So what good does that do if the board doesn't make that decision until the night he has the hearing? He wants that decision made before the hearing so that you guys can do your reports based on the information you got. So to me, this is either delegate it to somebody, either Banish or Schley,
Very well.
or don't
Okay.
delegate it. So,
Or come back.
Mr. Banish, do you feel comfortable with them
Yes.
delegating it to you?
Yes, if you do, yes.
Okay, so how
And
does
the
everybody feel?
I'm sorry,
How
Chairwoman, it's Andrew McNally. The
Yeah.
applicant would prefer that the board delegate this authority to Mr. Banish, correct?
That's correct.
How does the board feel about delegating it? Does that, anybody feel that it should not be delegated?
Just so you know, I'm not taking a position on it, but the MLUL specifically says that either the board, a committee of the board, or a board designee can make completeness determination. So this is not like breaking new ground. There's no precedent.
Right.
It says it in the MLUL, you're allowed to do this.
All right.
And the board's past practice to have these matters always come before the board actually flowed from a history of some disappointment with those completeness determinations being made administratively. That's how we got here.
And just so you know, of all my boards, I have 8 boards, you're the only board that still makes these determinations itself. All the other boards either delegate it to a committee or to the engineer or to the planner.
Okay, so where are we? Would anybody like to make a motion on this?
Can I just ask one point of clarification? So including the environmental impact assessment and Mr. Banish reviewing it, he's just reviewing to say whether it's included, right? He's not
correct.
He's not reviewing to say, hey, there's a lot of bad environmental impact here.
That's correct.
That's correct.
That's still our job.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, would anybody like to make a motion on this completeness application?
So again, the motion would be to grant the one waiver for the LOI and to delegate the completeness determination to Mr. Banish. And Mr.
That's
Banish,
right.
that means you have the MLUL 45 days from when they submit to make the determination, just like the board would have. You don't have to wait the 45 days, but if you go beyond 45 days, it's going to be deemed automatically complete.
Another clarification, it's delegating to both Mr. Schley and Mr. Banish, right? For Mr. Schley for 2, 3, 4, 5, Mr. Banish
No.
for 6, 7?
No.
They were going to delegate it all to Mr. Banish. I mean, it's up to you. You can delegate it to both of them, one of them,
Why
whatever.
don't you delegate it to both of us? If I could just jump in, this is Dave Schley.
Okay.
And that's because I'm used to seeing the other stuff routinely, and it's just easier.
Okay, Mr. Zidell?
Dave Banish and I will coordinate on that together.
Okay, Mr. Zidell?
Mr. Drill, can you clarify, when does the clock for action run if they make the completeness determination themselves? Do we have to ratify it, or if they decide next week, does the time run?
No. From when they submit their last item, you have 45 days to make the completeness determination. The completeness determination is then a written determination. The minute that determination is made, and the application is complete, the time clock starts to run on how many days you have to decide the application.
Thank you.
Okay, would anybody like to make the motion that Mr. Drill just stated?
I'll move it.
I think Laura Mandic was the first one. A second, please.
Second, Andrew McNally.
Okay, so it's Ms. McManduke and Mr. McNally. Roll call, please.
Ms. Vacy,
Yes.
Committeeman Esposito,
Yes.
Committeewoman Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Ms. Manduke,
Yes.
Mr. Zidell,
Yes.
Mr. Demerjian,
Yes.
Chairwoman Padici.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank
Next
you all. Have a
item
nice evening.
is a public hearing continued from February 4th, 2020. William and Carol Moyer, block 11401, lot 11, 11 Mountain Road, minor subdivision, bulk variances, number PB 17001. Before you start, Mr. Parker and Mr. and Mrs. Moyer, what I'm going to do to try to keep the hearing moving is I'm going to mute everybody except for Mr. Parker and Mr. Drill. Yes.
Hi, Kippy. Based on the prior conversation I had with Mr. Drill, I will be recusing myself from this consideration.
Okay.
And seeing it's the last matter other than public, our comments, I'm gonna sign off for the night then, if that's okay.
Yes. Okay.
Why don't you ask to be excused from the rest of the meeting?
May I be excused from the rest of the meeting?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Good night. What I'm going to do is mute everybody except for Mr. Drill and myself and whoever is speaking. And then there is, if you, either the bottom or the top, there's 3 buttons with more. I'm on an iPad. That's all I can see. And there's a raise hand icon. And if you want to ask a question after the presentation, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. So
And
we're going to
Kippy,
see. Yes.
If you're on a laptop, you go to the participants on the bottom of the screen. If you click on participants, you can then raise your hand or unmute yourself.
Okay, that doesn't happen on an iPad or an iPhone. So right now, I am going to mute all and I'm going to unmute let me see here. Dory Parker, unmute. Oh, I can't. I either can mute all. I'm trying to unmute Mr. Parker.
No, I'm good. I'm unmuted.
You're unmuted. Okay. And let me get Mr. Drill. Okay. Are you unmuted, Mr. Drill, now?
I'm unmuted.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Parker.
And before he starts, just procedural history-wise, Mr. Parker, you were sworn to tell, I swore you in on February 4, 2020. You remember that?
Yes, I do.
You're still under oath.
Yes, thank you.
And just for the record, at the conclusion of the February 4th hearing session, the hearing was continued to April 7 with no need for further notice. Then on April 7, the board continued the hearing on the application again without need for further notice until June 2, 2020, and that's where we are right now.
Correct.
Okay, Mr. Parker, before you get into your presentation, the revised plans, Mr. Banish raised a threshold issue in this application that a variance is needed from the maximum lot yield requirement found in 21-10.4.b table 401A. And this would be a C variance. I'd like if you could outline the positive and negative criteria that the board should consider in granting this variance to subdivide the lot into two non-conforming lots. If you could just go through the positive and negative criteria for the board, please. This is
Yeah.
this a key issue for the for this application?
Sure, that's fine. I think that this is a C1 variance application. I believe that this is a hardship situation. And I say that because certainly the ordinance describes, as indicated both in Mr. Schley's letter and in Mr. Banish's letter, the ordinance describes the fact that the wetlands that are on this property are considered constrained areas. I'm just looking for the constrained areas is what they call it in the ordinance. And in performing the calculations of determining what the maximum lot yield is, that amount of wetlands gets subtracted from the total lot area, as well as any other of these constrained areas, which include steep slopes, although there are none on this property, and some other things that aren't here. And then the net result of that is divided by the allowable lot area to determine the maximum density, the maximum number of lots you can have. In this case, it comes out to be 1 if you subtract those area, the wetland area from the total area. But I think that this is a hardship application because it's a somewhat unique situation when you look at the property. And we did submit a letter from the wetland consultant for this project. These are isolated wetlands. The DEP has determined that they're isolated wetlands. They are a very low functional value wetlands. And as a result of that, they allow for filling of these wetlands under a general permit requirement. You still need to get a permit for it, but it's a general permit. And it's a pretty straightforward application. There's certain criteria that have to be met for that, but they do allow that. I think that when you look at your ordinance, technically these are constrained areas. But I think when you look at and Mr. Schley quotes it Mr. Banish quotes it in his review letter. When you look at the ordinance number 1870, the enacting ordinance, it says, this procedure is designed to ensure that the number of new lots created will be calibrated to the amount of land that is suitable for development. Now, that's where I think this is a unique situation because this property already is developed. And by that, I mean, it's been developed for 30 plus years in that it's maintained as a lawn right now. It's no longer a natural or wooded area.
Mr. Parker, can I just interrupt you for a second? I'm looking at my notes. We're back to where we were on February 4th. This is the argument you made on February 4th. I asked you, I said, are you sure you want to go C1 variance due to wetlands? What distinguishes this lot from all others? And in fact, the ordinance says that you have to include the wetlands. And then the suggestion was made, well, you could get a general permit 6. If you went and got the general permit 6 and you filled the wetlands, then you could actually come back to the board and you wouldn't need the variance. So to me, hardship's not available. I thought you were going to come back and make some sort of C2 variance argument. In other words, explain to the board what benefit is there to the public for the board to grant a C2 variance to allow the subdivision to be granted tonight versus the applicant going to the DEP. It actually doesn't even have to go to the DEP, right? A general. How do you go about getting a general permit number 6?
And there's an application process for that. Some of those can be done online. Some of those can be, you just meet the requirements and you submit that into the DEP. So,
right, and boom, you get it. So explain to the board, what's your client, what are you offering in this application that you wouldn't have to offer if you got the general 6 permit and came back with a fully conforming application where the board would have no choice but to grant the approval? What perks, what public benefits are you offering if they grant you the variance tonight? That's a C2 variance. So what are you offering?
Well, that wasn't part of the application. What we were going to, suggest was making that a condition of the approval from the board that we get a GP6.
Okay, but so what reason should they grant the variance then? Legally, I don't think you have hardship as a matter of law, because a lot of people have wetlands. You have an ordinance that specifically says you're not supposed to count the wetlands. Your argument is the ordinance says you can't count the wetlands. That's a hardship. My response is the ordinance says you can't count the wetlands. That's what you need the variance from. It's not like a legally recognized argument. So I can make a C2 argument, but that's not my job. So think about it. What in this application, you're offering to do certain things. You are. I've seen the things you're offering to do that if you came in with a conforming application, you wouldn't have to do. So tell the board, what are you offering to do?
I mean, what we're proposing and suggesting is here, we're proposing to some of the property or some of the wetlands out there will be preserved within a conservation easement as part of the subdivision. We're developing the property in a manner that's consistent with the zoning ordinance and what it allows to happen, other than the variance situation that may exist here. Those are the things that we're proposing to do out here. And
Parker, would you be proposing those same things if you had the general permit number 6 and you came in with a conforming application? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Kippy, should I just leave it alone, or?
Well, I don't know where we are at this point. I certainly don't want to put the board through something that they don't have to go through.
And my client's the board. My client's not the Moyes. So I feel very uncomfortable but saying anything else. I mean, I know the C2 argument I would make, but it's not my job to make it.
Mr. Parker, do you see it as C2? Or are you still saying it's C1 hardship?
I was prepared to make a C1 argument this evening because I think it certainly applies in this case that, the ordinance talks about land that's suitable for development as the underlying reason why you have to consider those constrained areas. I think that this property is suitable for development because it's already been developed. I think it's a technicality with the ordinance in that we're trying to apply an ordinance that I think doesn't apply.
Okay.
And you basically have said that if you got a number 6,
a general permit number 6.
General permit number 6, that you would be coming in with the same proposal that you are tonight?
That's correct.
Well, so let me ask you, because we asked you this back in February. Why don't you go get the general permit?
Then
and
why
come back with a
didn't
conforming
you get
application?
number 6 and then tell us and come in with a proposal with the number 6?
It sounds like that's probably the best thing to do at this point.
Then in essence, Mr. Drill, does that mean that we do not hear this tonight and we wait until number 6 is approved and then
Then come back and he eliminates the variance then. If he gets the general permit number 6, he doesn't have a variance that he has to apply for anymore. And
even
the board
for
doesn't
the coverage, even for the coverage one, the second one,
that one.
they were going to do the fill.
Right, that one he may still need, but at least he eliminates this one and he doesn't force the board into a precedent where they're granting a variance for this that other people could then argue, well, you did it for the Moyes, why aren't you going to do it for us?
How, Mr. Parker, do you want to talk to your?
Yeah, do you want to take like a 5-minute recess and call them and talk to them?
Yeah, sure. I think we can do that. I think, and just there is only one variance that we're requesting. It's the one that we talked about, the lot density variance. The other minimum improvable area is not a variance situation in this case. Again, your ordinance doesn't, for that calculation, doesn't consider the wetlands after it's been filled. So that variance has been eliminated, but there's just one. So yeah, if I can speak to my clients real quick, I'll try to call them on the phone and we can
Okay, Mr. Banish has raised his hand. And I'm going to unmute Mr. Banish. Hope I can do this. It says ask to unmute. I think that's it. Okay, Mr. Banish, are you unmuted?
I think I am.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Banish.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Yes, you are.
Okay, so what I think has just happened here is that the applicant has decided that he's going to go pursue the GP6. And then he's going to return to the board after he has the GP6. And he's, before commencing any construction, any disturbance on the site or anything of that nature, he's going to return to the board for subdivision approval.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's what he's going to talk to his client about. But that would eliminate the variance. That would eliminate having to create a precedent that someone else could argue for, unless he could think of a reason that the board should grant the variance tonight, which in my opinion, legally cannot be a C1. It would only have to be a C2. That's what he's got to talk to the client about.
Mr. Parker, do you want to talk to your partner? Do we talk now or?
I think he should talk to his client without us listening. I think he should
Yes,
mute
I
himself.
think
They
you've
should
got to
mute him,
just
and he should call
basically
him on the cell phone.
call him
Yeah.
on the cell phone.
Just 5 minutes, Madam Chairman. I
No
think
problem. No problem.
Okay.
We'll give you
Sorry about
5.
that. Okay.
Kippy, you want to take like a 5-minute recess? Because I'd like to call and speak to Mr. Banish and Mr. Schley.
Yes, we're on recess now, Ms. Kiefer.
All right, can you mute me and can you mute David Banish?
I'll mute everybody.
Call Banish.
Okay, everybody is muted. Hello. What a god-awful mess.
Kippy, Kippy, you gotta mute yourself. You gotta mute yourself.
Oh.
Don't say anything till you're muted.
Okay. I think we're back. Have we got everybody back? We've lost some people. Ms. Harris is back. Mr. Demerjian. Let's see here. Mr. Banish is there. We got Mr. McNally. Okay, I think we got everybody back. Okay, I know. Hold on. Okay, I'm going to unmute Mr. Drill and I'm going to unmute Mr. Banish
And also please unmute Mr. Parker.
and Mr. Parker.
And what the heck, Mr. Schley.
Wait a minute. And Mr. Schley. Where is Mr. Schley?
Mr. Schley's on his cell phone, which is the
I got it.
1071.
Yeah, I got it. All right. Is everybody, are all these people unmuted? Mr. Parker?
Yes, I am.
Mr.
Parker.
Banish?
Am I audible?
Yes, we have a little unusual, let's say, suggestion to make, but before, did you speak with your client?
Yes, I did.
Okay, before you lock into anything, what is the client's inclination, but it's not a decision at this point?
Inclination is to carry the application this evening and apply for a GP6, secure that from the DEP, and then come back with a conforming application.
So this is going to sound a little unusual to the board. So I spoke with Mr. Banish about it. I tried to speak to Mr. Schley about it, but I couldn't get him on his cell. I spoke with the chair about it. Mr. Banish believes that there are public benefits that would benefit the township as a whole if a C2 variance was granted to approve the application tonight. In essence, Mr. Parker is primarily an engineering expert. He also has a planning license, but honestly, Mr. Parker, what percentage of your professional work is done engineering versus planning?
Probably over 95% is engineering.
Right. Mr. Banish, on the other hand, does 100% planning. And so unless any board member has a problem with what is about to occur, Mr. Banish is the board's expert. But in this unique case where for a C2 variance, there has to be public benefits, if Mr. Banish believes that there are public benefits to the township that he thinks the board should know about, he'd like to tell the board about that. And then perhaps the board might want to grant the C2 variance tonight because he thinks, Mr. Banish thinks there are benefits of granting it tonight and not having the general permit 6 go first, but have more control over what happens when they go for the general permit number 6. So if any board member objects, could you please raise your hand? Okay, so no one's raising their hand. So Mr. Banish, why don't you begin and explain what benefits you think, what public benefits there are if the board granted a C2 variance to approve the application tonight?
Okay. There are site-specific issues that could be impacted by the granting of a GP6 and the plan developed as proposed in the most recent revision submitted by the applicant. What the applicant has shown on his plan is a 200-foot front yard setback. The 200-foot front yard setback by necessity pushes the proposed new residential dwelling and fill deeper into the wetlands fill area that's proposed. The required setback is 100 feet. By moving the house forward on the lot to a 100-foot setback from Martinsville Road and from Mountain Road, less of an area of wetlands would have to be filled, and so there would be a diminished impact on that natural resource. I did hear what Mr. Parker said about his opinion about the value of those resources, but the point I want to make is that the 200-foot setback, I think, was really a concession to an observation and a comment that was made, which is that the master plan encourages a 200-foot setback in the CR1 and the CR2 districts in the land use plan, which includes this site, when proposed new development can't be situated behind natural features in the terrain, such as tree lines and hedgerows. There is a hedgerow along the Mountain Road frontage as well as the Martinsville Road frontage, and it probably occupies something on the magnitude of about 50 or 60% of the total road frontage. In other words, there's already an existing hedgerow, and with some enhancements to the hedgerow, development of a single-family dwelling at the 100-foot setback line wouldn't be as noticeable from either of those two public roads, and so it would address that recommendation in the master plan, in the land use plan element. At the same time, as I said a moment ago, by moving the dwelling in what is essentially a southerly and easterly direction on the site toward Mountain Road, away from the wetlands, or from as deep an incursion into the wetlands, similarly closer to Mountain Road, reducing the amount of wetland fill necessary to accommodate the dwelling, the impact on the wetlands would be lessened. So I think there's a public benefit to that. Insofar, and so if the board agrees that, minimizing the amount of fill on wetlands is a good idea, if that can be achieved now, then now may be a better time than after the applicant pursues a greater fill area under the GP6 general permit, and the board ends up losing a greater area of wetlands to this proposed development than is necessary to accommodate the development that's proposed. And on the assumption that the board would agree that filling less areas of wetlands is desirable, then there is a purpose of the municipal land use law that would be served by not sending the applicant to the DEP before the board continues to hear and decide on this application. And I'll put that in the record once I actually get some feedback from the board as to whether or not you think these are benefits that accrue to the benefit of the community as I do.
So Kippy, I think at this point, what Mr. Banish wants to know is, what is the board's feeling on that? Because if the board indicates, yes, they believe that would be a public benefit, then Mr. Banish is willing to go further and identify a purpose of the MLUL which would be advanced. If the board doesn't feel that imposing a condition to move the dwellings up to the 100-foot setback would be desirable, then Mr. Banish will just end it there, and then you tell the applicant to go get their GP6 first. Now, before we do that though, Mr. Parker, can you call your client and see if the board believes that filling less wetlands is a public purpose? Would your client be willing to move the dwelling from 200-foot setback to closer to 100-foot setback?
Yes, I can say that they would. That would be fine.
Okay, so Kippy, I don't know, you're gonna have to figure out how to unmute people to get people's feelings on this before Mr. Banish goes any further.
Okay. It seems like, and then I'm trying to unmute everybody. Cancel. I'm trying to unmute everybody at this point. I'm having trouble because it says I can mute all, but I think everybody has to. Okay, let me do it this way. All right, people can unmute themselves now just by hitting, they have the permission to unmute themselves. So would anybody like to comment by unmuting themselves?
I believe Mr. Crane had his hand up first.
Okay, Mr. Crane?
I like Mr. Banish's suggestion. My only concern is without the disturbance of the wetlands, do we have the lot yield? Would be the only issue. That's what's really created the availability of the lot yield.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Banish.
Well, I think there have to be a balancing to ensure that he meets that standard and doesn't require the variance or the
No, you don't understand. The board would grant that C2 variance, Mr. Crane. Mr. Banish is explaining why it would be a public benefit to grant that variance if the dwelling was moved up closer to 100 feet. That would be the public benefit is less fill of the wetlands. That's the reason to grant the C2 variance. What Mr. Banish is saying is there's a benefit to granting the C2 variance tonight before they have to get a GP6, because if they go get the GP6, they can fill and become a compliant application. They can put that house wherever they want it, as long as it's 100 feet back. And if
Yeah,
they put
let's
it
talk about that GP6 for a second. The GP6 authorizes the fill of up to an acre of wetlands. That's a very substantial amount of land that they actually don't need to appropriately site the dwelling on the lot if they use the 100-foot setback line. So they can reduce the amount of fill necessary to construct the dwelling, get a little bit of usable area around the dwelling as well. But after a review of DEP's wetlands, I'm reasonably confident that they'll be able to get that GP6. And the idea here is to keep them from filling as much as an acre when it's really not necessary to accommodate the development that's proposed. Or the
you understand what he's saying? He's not.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. The variances to they wouldn't meet the lot yield.
That's right.
Okay.
We don't know.
And that's what you'd be granting the C2 variance for.
Okay. The second question would be, the minimum building approvable lot might also get reduced. We'd have to see it on the plan to see if we have the 22,000 after that's done.
I agree with that, Mr. Crane, and it would be up to the applicant, I think, to come back with that plan with revisions to satisfy the board. And if he needed a variance, he's already got reasons, presumably, if the variance is granted, that he could rely on to make his case for any additional variance relief that may be required.
Okay. The other thing, would you suggest that the driveway location change then to Martinsville Road?
I don't want to design this subdivision for the site.
No, not Martinsville Road.
Huh?
County Planning Board won't give us access onto Martinsville Road.
Okay, so you're gonna have disturbance through the wetlands to get to the house.
Well, I'm not sure about that. We may be able to site the driveway in a location that would not be in the wetlands. I'm looking at the plan.
Further east, you're saying?
Wait a minute, I think we're starting to review the application and we have the issue at hand about the board's view of whether they want to, given what Mr. Banish says, want to proceed and hear about consider granting the variance. We have not, if that's the case, we will go into the application shortly, but I'd like to keep the discussion now to how the board feels about the process that Mr. Banish has outlined. Any other comments?
Right. This is a straw poll to see if people believe
Right. So
that less
go
filling
through.
of wetlands is beneficial, so that Mr. Banish continues his testimony, which will be to support a C2 variance.
Okay, another question before the straw poll, Mr. Zidell.
Yeah, I think that I certainly respect Mr. Banish's opinion, and I do pay attention to it. But I think it takes a bad development proposal and just at best makes it maybe not so bad. I don't think there's a real public benefit there. I mean, if this was a larger wetland area that we didn't want to encroach on, but it looks like it's a fairly local one. The lot yield was a problem from the beginning. There's a question as to whether this is a suitable site for development anyway. And I'm still going to have questions that I raised last time about in this particular district, whether more housing should go in. I'm not persuaded that it's a public benefit.
Okay, but Mr. Zidell, I'm not arguing one way or the other. If the board says no to the variance tonight, or says they're not willing to grant the variance tonight, and they go to the DEP and get a general permit number 6, if they come back with a fully conforming minor subdivision application, the board's going to have no choice but to grant it.
I heard you before. Thank you, Mr. Joel. And I fully understand that.
Okay.
And I appreciate it. And the law is what the law is. And if the law allows them to do that, that's fine, but we do have to deal with the ordinance as it is. I think the ordinance was enacted for very good reasons. I worry about precedent and other things.
Okay.
I'm not seeing the public benefit here.
Gotcha.
Okay, so you would be in the straw poll not to proceed the way it's been described.
That's correct.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Demerjian.
I do see a public benefit, and I like the proposal from Mr. Banish.
Okay. Ms. Manduk, you have to unmute yourself. Okay.
I think there's a benefit, and I'd like to go with the proposal.
Okay, Ms. Mastrangelo?
I agree. I believe that there's a public benefit in that there's less impact on the wetlands. And I do believe, given that there's a row of hedgerows there, the 100-foot setback isn't as difficult, for lack of a better word, as it could be. So for those reasons, I would be in favor of Mr. Banish's proposal.
Okay, Committeewoman Harris? Got to unmute. Oh, there you are.
Sorry. So I do think there's a benefit as well for the reasons that all the predecessors said.
Okay. Mr. McNally, you have to unmute yourself.
I agree there's a benefit. I'm content to proceed.
Okay, Mr. Hurley?
I also agree there's a benefit, less fill.
Okay, Ms. AC? Ms. AC?
You have to unmute yourself.
She said she's unmuted, but I can't hear her.
On this one, if we can't hear her, wait a minute. Jen, can you hear us? Raise your hand. Put it this way. Thumbs up, benefit, thumbs down, no benefit. Thumbs
Okay,
up.
fine, thank you. Mr. Crane?
Yes, I'd like to proceed.
Okay, so it looks like.
Kippy, you didn't indicate where you are on this.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go forward and with the variance.
Okay, so Mr. Banish, then, can you continue your testimony? It looks like the majority of the board, straw polled, believes that there is a public benefit to lessening the amount of filling of wetlands. So can you explain what purpose under the MLUL would be advanced by having less fill in the wetlands besides, purpose A, which is the general welfare? So I'm assuming that you're going to say A, but are there any other purposes that you think are advanced besides purpose A?
Yes, I do. I think there's a significant one, but I think the board has to be mindful of the ancillary benefits of considering the change that I recommended in understanding how this particular purpose of the land use law applies in this case. And I'm going to read it to you right now. It's in section 2M of the MLUL, and it reads, to encourage coordination of the various public and private procedures and activities shaping land development with a view of lessening the cost of such development into the more efficient use of the land. By acknowledging and recognizing the fact that NJDEP has enacted regulations that permit up to an acre of fill on a site of wetlands, and by taking action and coordinating this municipal action, that is a review and approval of a subdivision, it advances that particular purpose of the law, and at the same time, it will maintain more hydrologic function of the existing wetlands on site than diverting them from their natural hydrologic function. Even though, as Mr. Parker indicated, they may be of marginal value, they are nevertheless of some value to the ecosystem, and I think they should be preserved. So by addressing the situation and the variance at hand from a design perspective and moving development away from deeper incursions into the wetlands, I believe that purpose 2M is served, as well as sound planning and preservation of the natural environment.
Let me ask Mr. Parker, can you estimate if the building was moved instead of 200 feet away to 100 feet away, do you know how much less fill you'd have to bring in other words, when you apply to the DEP for the GP6, how much less fill will end up filling wetlands? Can you give an estimate?
Well, so I'm looking at the plan that we submitted to the board, and real quick, if I could just make one suggestion. I know Mr. Banner suggested 100 feet. If I could just ask if we can make that maybe 105, just to maintain a proper separation distance to the septic system.
Of
That would
course,
help.
if that's sound planning, Mr. Parker, and it serves to achieve the overall objective that we're talking about here. I mean, obviously, it's the board's decision, but it seems to make sense as as an appropriate design option if that's one of your design limitations.
Okay, and I'm just in looking at the plan that we have, you know, if you look at basically, I'm scaling the distance that we're showing the proposed disturbance behind the proposed house, and I'm kind of transferring that over. So, you know, the limit of disturbance may go, you know, basically just probably to the limit of the wetland line. It would go into the buffer and maybe a little bit into the wetland area. So as an estimate, it would be significantly less disturbance of the wetlands.
Well, I know that. What's the estimate of how many cubic yards or how many cubic feet? How much acreage?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get into the substance of the application, presumably after this discussion, and perhaps that's better quantifiable or easier to quantify after the board has a little bit more discussion about this.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, at this point, I think we have to go in, since the straw poll indicated that we see a public benefit to hearing the discussion of granting the variance, that we should go into the application. Mr. Drill, do you agree?
Yes.
Do you agree, Mr. Drill? Okay. So I guess we would turn it back, Mr. Parker, to you to go through the amended plans that you had submitted for this meeting.
But assuming that you're going to have to move the buildings now to 105
You're
feet
gonna have
back.
to move 105 feet. If you could go through the plans and tell us how things would change from the plans of March 16, 2020 was the last revision.
There is one point I would like to add, just to make it clear why the board is considering this. And that is because the DEP regulations identify the ability to fill up to an acre of wetlands. And that's what's being avoided here. That's the whole point behind it.
That's why I was trying to find out if you could give the board an estimate right now before we got into the details of how much less than 1 acre of fill.
Well, Steve, you're at 40,000 square feet of fill right now. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, I hate to say this without, you know, doing a grading plan, but it would be significantly less, may only be somewhere between 5,000 or 10,000 square feet of disturbance within the wetland itself.
So let me ask one final question. Does it make sense then, hearing the straw poll of the board, to go back, carry this one more time, revise the plan, so you're not doing guesstimated or estimated testimony? And
I think so.
And we have a
Right,
done
because
deal?
otherwise we'd have so many conditions we'd have to put conditions on. Whereas if you came back with another set of plans that considered this, we could go and look at those plans and make a determination based on those plans without all the conditions.
And maybe Mr. Parker could have a meeting over Zoom or whatever with the two Daves and get their input on it. And if he listens to the two Daves, I assume, but you know, they don't speak for the board, but if he follows their lead, I assume that the plan that will emerge will probably be in the realm of acceptable. That's my guess.
And wouldn't that also have a benefit that Mr. Schley made a lot of comments about the plans?
Right.
And
Could
those
eliminate
could
a
all
lot.
be cleared up and eliminated.
Yep.
So that when we come back, there would be very few comments that would have to be considered from Mr. Schley and Mr. Banish. Mr. Parker?
I agree. I think that's the best way to proceed. I think we should revise the plans and come back to the board, because then I can give exact numbers and we'll know for sure whether we're going to need the minimum improvable area variance as well. So I'd rather make sure we have all those numbers nailed down and firmed up when we come back to the board. I'm just looking at Mr. Schley's letter to see if there's any other comments that might be helpful while we're here with the board, just to go over very quickly. And maybe I'll defer to Mr. Schley if he can think of anything off the top of his head that might be helpful for us to go over. I think most of the comments the applicant is going to agree to provide, but I think there's some that were prompting discussion with the board.
While Mr. Parker's looking at that, Mr. Hurley, if you would get a copy of the recording of the February 4 hearing, if you can read that and sign a certification, you'll be eligible to vote on the application, because right now, technically, you're not.
Right, I couldn't do it the last time.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
So if you could talk to Cindy, maybe she can email you or mail you a copy.
Okay.
Mr. Parker, wouldn't it be better if you just take these comments and incorporate them into the revised set of plans?
Yes.
And then we could have all the testimony and everything at one hearing, as opposed to having a little bit now and then a little bit then?
I agree 100%. I was just checking to see if there's anything that Mr. Schley recommended the board discuss. And I don't really, I think you're right. I think I can work through these comments with Mr. Schley and Mr. Banish before the next hearing.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. So I guess the next question is when? Ms. Kiefer, if you could unmute, please. When do you think you could have these plans revised and go through the meetings with Mr. Banish and Mr. Schley?
When's the next available hearing? We wouldn't be able, certainly not June. Was there a meeting in July?
So Mr. Parker, the board has a 21-day rule. So you need to get the plans filed with the board 21 days before the hearing to begin with. You won't have to notice because we can make an announcement, but how many days do you, first of all, you have to have a meeting with them. After the meeting, how many days do you think you will need to change the plans? That's the first question.
Right.
I mean, we can get it done within a week after we have a meeting.
So let's assume for argument's sake that Mr. Banish and Mr. Schley, how do you guys look for next week? Are you available for a meeting?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so assume you have a meeting next week and then give yourself 2 weeks. So now you're talking near the end of June to make the submission. So you're talking the earliest that you'd be able to have a hearing would be the board's second meeting in July. Now, I don't know what the.
Now there is a hearing scheduled already.
So what,
We
okay,
have,
what's
our
the,
next available hearing date would be August 4th.
okay. August 4th. Now, I'm going to suggest that the applicant grant an extension of the time to decide the application.
Well, actually, I think I have a problem with August 4th. I don't think I'm going to be available. I'm not available on August 4th.
Okay, what's the meeting after August 4th?
August 18th.
August 18th. Mr. Parker, you available August 18th?
Yes.
So now I'm going
Okay,
to suggest that the applicant extend the time to decide the application to the end, to September 30th, that the board carry the application with no need for further notice to August 18th. And just, Mr. Parker, you have to determine if you need any variance that hasn't been noticed, then you should also notice that variance before the August 18th meeting.
Right, okay.
okay. All right, so this application will be continued to August 18th with no further notice unless another variance is needed, and then you would have to notice for that variance.
And Mr. Parker and the Moyes, who I see are also listening in. Everyone consents to extend the time the board has to decide the application to September 30th?
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah, Mr. Moyer, you said yes, okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Parker and Mr. and Mrs. Moyer. Next item is comments from members. Any comments from members? Comments from staff?
No, Madam Chair, thank you.
Okay. Ms. Kiefer, are there any changes on the pending applications memo that you just sent out?
Nothing that I'm aware of, other than the addition of our new August 18th hearing for the Moyer application.
Okay, so there is nothing on the agenda for June 16th, 2020 meeting. So I will be canceling that meeting. And Ms. Kiefer, if you could let everybody who's board members who are not here, notify them that the June 16th meeting has been canceled. With that, I will take a motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make that
moved.
So
motion.
moved.
Second,
Okay, Ms. Committeewoman Harris, and a second.
I'll second.
Second.
Oh, second by Ms. Manduke. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I,
Opposed? Abstained? Thank you. Have a nice
Night.
evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Have a
everybody.
nice evening, everybody.
See you again.
Okay, Kippy, if you can make me host again?
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now. There you are. You're the host now, Chris.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Hey,
You too, Chris. Bye-bye.